Welcome everyone. This is the first of the Global Psychedelic Society's activation events, and we're so jazzed to have you all here. My name is Maritza Sturtz. I'm one of the co-stewards of the GPS, and for those of you out there attending who are not too familiar with the GPS, otherwise known as the Global Psychedelic Society, we are an organization here to support communities worldwide in fostering healing, growth, and safe, responsible use of psychedelics through advocacy, collaboration, and cultural dialogue. We're basically a hub that connects societies to each other and to the resources in the psychedelic ecosystem. And that's something we all get to do together today. So this activation event, the first of its kind, is something where we're live streaming. So this video you're seeing right now is happening in 17 other places. With all that being said, I'll just give you guys a little overview of what's to be expected, and we'll get going. So we're going to begin with intros for our moderator and panelists. We'll dive into a very juicy conversation, the inauguration integration, and we'll follow that with the Q&A. As well as some activations where you everybody attending here gets to brainstorm and think on the issues near at hand and near to our panelists and dear to our panelists. So really, really excited to bring you into this conversation. Welcome, Annie. She is our moderator. So Annie Oak Harrison is a San Francisco-based journalist with a focus on science, business, and public policy. She has worked for numerous media organizations, including national public radio stations, Wired News, Fast Company, and Agence France Presse. In 2020, Annie co-founded Lucid News, an online news service that covers psychedelics. She now serves as editorial director of Lucid News and holds an MS in science reporting from Columbia University. As a public health activist, Annie co-founded the Women's Visionary Council, the first nonprofit for psychedelic women, and the immersive arts organization Take Three Presents. She is the co-founder of the Full Circle Tea House and the Women's Visionary Congress, and Annie is passionate about creating spaces for community collaboration and promoting risk reduction and mediation strategies for people who use psychedelics. All right, Annie, so glad to have you here. Thank you. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Maritza. It's a very kind introduction. Hello, everybody. I am speaking to you from Haight-Ashbury, America's first psychedelic neighborhood. You could see it right outside my window. So I would like to start our discussion today with a brief recap of some of the things that have occurred since the inauguration of Donald Trump for his second term as US president. So let's kick it off by looking at a few things that have taken place. Donald Trump has tested some of the general norms of the democratic process with assertions of personal power that have challenged the courts, Congress, and ethical lines. The following information are statements of fact. President Trump has freed people who rioted in the Capitol 4 years ago, stripped former advisors of security details, allowed the TikTok app to remain in use despite national security concerns, eliminated DEI initiatives, and ordered government workers to essentially snitch on those suspected of not embracing this policy or face, quote, adverse consequences. Trump has fired more than a dozen inspector general who monitor government departments for corruption and abuse, ignoring a law requiring 30 days notice to Congress and giving specific reasons for this action. Trump has initiated mass deportations, pulled out of an international climate agreement, fired political appointees from the last administration, and further militarized the southern border with Mexico, plus prompting what some call, quote, anticipatory obedience from businesses, universities, and the media. He has decided to rewrite the 14th Amendment to declare that all children born in the US do not get automatic citizenship, and released a crypto token that could make him large amounts of money and allow companies and financial players to potentially curry favor with this administration. In addition, he has surrounded himself with billionaires, given Elon Musk a mandate to restructure the government, potentially making Musk even more money through various federal contracts. Trump has also declared that the Gulf of Mexico is now the Gulf of America, is pressuring Canada to become the 51st state, and wants to potentially use force to take over Greenland and seize the Panama Canal. Plus, Trump has signed an order requiring the government to only recognize a person's biological sex at birth, whether it's deemed male or female, effectively erasing transgender, non-binary, and intersex people from federal law. So, welcome to the new Republican administration, which now effectively controls both the executive and legislative branches of government. So, that is the environment that we find ourselves in right now. With that, I'd like to introduce our panelists to comment on what this means for everyone assembled today and related organizations. Ismail Ali, he, him, or they, them, is Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS, where he leads psychedelic policy reform efforts globally. Licensed to practice law in California, Ismail co-founded and co-chairs the Psychedelic Bar Association's Board of Directors. He has held leadership roles in organizations like Students for Sensible Drug Policy, Chacruna Institute, and the Ayahuasca Defense Fund, and recently co-founded Central California's Psychedelic Summit in his hometown of Fresno. Welcome. Maritza Perez Medina is the Director of Federal Affairs at the Drug Policy Alliance in Washington, D.C., managing the organization's legislative agenda and advocacy efforts. Previously, she served as Senior Policy Analyst at the Center for American Progress and as a legislative staff attorney at MALDEF. A graduate of UC Berkeley School of Law and the University of Nevada, Reno, Maritza is a recognized expert in criminal justice and drug policy and has been featured in numerous national media outlets, including the Washington Post, the New York Times, and NPR. Welcome, Maritza. Jason Ortiz is the Director of Strategic Initiatives for the Last Prisoner Project, focusing on policy and advocacy for incarcerated individuals affected by drug laws. Cannabis justice advocate since age 16, Jason co-founded the Minority Cannabis Business Association and helped draft Connecticut's 2021 cannabis legalization framework. He is the former executive director of Students for Sensible Drug Policy, where he trains students to combat the war on drugs, and has served as the policy director for CT for accessible psychedelic medicine and president of the Connecticut Puerto Rican Agenda. Welcome, Jason. So I'd like to start off our panel discussion with a broad question. We've seen some actions from this new administration that suggest potential immediate impacts on drug policy. For example, Trump's pick for DEA administrator, Florida Sheriff Chad Chronister, supported a 2020 decision by county commissioners in Hillsborough County, Florida, to treat possession of up to 20 grams of cannabis as a civil offense instead of a misdemeanor. Well, that's interesting. And Trump has also pardoned darknet market Silk Road founder Ross Ulbricht, also known as Dread Pirate Roberts. And that was noted, certainly, by people who have been following the Silk Road story. And Ulbricht has been in prison for some time and has now been freed. So the question is, panelists, what do you think Trump and his appointees will due to potentially have impact on drug policy from the perspective of your organizations, both locally and globally. Uh, Jason, let's start with you on this, if we could.
Sure, I can kick it off. So again, my name is Jason Ortiz. I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives for the Last Prisoner Project, and we are a national nonprofit that helps folks that are currently incarcerated for drug crimes seek freedom in all the various ways that we can. There are actually significantly more folks at the state level than at the federal level. And so we do pressure executive branch officials, both governors and presidents, to use their pardon authority, which is one of the things we're going to talk about a lot, I'm sure, on this panel. But also we seek to expand eligibility for release. And so we do that through various types of legislation, whether that's small pieces at the local level or full legalization bills, because we do believe that in order to get to the last prisoner, we have to stop putting people in prison. So we do support, generally speaking, broad decriminalization and legalization efforts. And so definitely, I think the pardon piece is where I'll start, right? Because we were pushing very hard to have President Biden actually take significant action on releasing prisoners at the federal level. And while he did do some really amazing work, specifically on the folks that were incarcerated under the crack cocaine disparity, he did not release most of the people that are incarcerated for cannabis, with roughly only 8 folks that were actually released from prison or home confinement from his work. And so that means there are still nearly 3,000 people that are currently incarcerated in federal prison for President Trump, to potentially release as well. Now, Trump made it very clear that he's willing to use his pardon authority before the end of his term, right? And so generally speaking, prior to that, presidents did most of the pardons at the very end of their term. Biden did follow that historical precedent, but Trump came out in day 1 and day 2 pardoning thousands of people. So while I don't agree with all of his pardons in this particular context, it does mean that the push for freedom via executive channels is wide open for the next 4 years. And our inability to predict what Trump may do actually opens up some opportunity for us to be able to push immediately to get all of those folks out of prison. And so Ross Ulbricht is somebody that was incarcerated for a drug crime that did get released relatively quickly, right? The first full day. And so he is somebody that is more of the libertarian leaning side of things. And it was a promise that President Trump said at the Libertarian Conference when he was courting their votes. And so I wasn't surprised that it happened. I was surprised at how fast it happened, for sure. But I was also surprised at the writ large, how big of a use of his pardon authority he did use. And, where before it was very much about the actual legal situations that folks were in, the specific crimes that they committed, when folks were interviewing Trump officials about how he decided to do all of the January 6 folks, it was basically, he was just getting confused with the details and said, F it, just do them all. And so the thought process behind how they're going to make pardon decisions is definitely wildly different than the last administration. Now, outside of the president himself, his appointments outside of RFK are not looking good for drug policy, right? So there are definitely lots of folks in various aspects. The most current DEA administrator is somebody, or most likely folks to take over the DEA is somebody that is not on board with legalization, generally speaking, and that will have a huge impact on all of this. Now, we'll talk about RFK a little bit later, but I do think that specifically Health and Human Services, their impact on the scheduling process is going to be very important for us moving forward, both for cannabis and for other drugs, because Health and Human Services can initiate rescheduling or descheduling hearings. They play a big role in it. They don't have the ultimate final say, sort of. It's a little murky exactly, what they can and can't do or stop, but they'll play a huge role. And in this context, both for cannabis and other drugs, could scrap the old way of doing things and have a conversation specifically on full legalization or descheduling of cannabis and other psychedelics. And so these appointments are going to play a huge role. And I think there's some hope there, but overall, as we've heard in these executive orders and one of his advisors' most recent actions, we are drifting a bit stronger into not just like conservative territory, but like full fascist territory, right? And when we look at how that impacts civil liberties more generally, that is horrendous for anyone that doesn't want the police or other types of government officials in their homes, checking on them, whether it's their religious values, their sexual orientation, or whatever it may be, we're looking at some pretty dark days when it comes to civil liberties. And so I think all of these difficulties are opportunities for us to organize with the other communities that are being impacted by these situations and show that we are part of the broader progressive movement towards freedom and justice. And so when it comes to civil liberties, there's lots of criminal justice groups that have been working on this for a very long time that we can assist and work with them, right? There are folks in the immigrant communities that have been working on protecting our immigrant friends and families for a very long time. And we're talking about protecting indigenous medicines. We can support them in their fights and their efforts. So I think there's going to be a lot of challenges ahead based on what we're looking at for this particular administration. But again, as I say all the time, as much as possible, when times are most difficult, it's when organizers and activists are most important. And so we have to be the folks to get out there and help and support folks, be the helpers that we want to see so that we could get past all the dread that is currently sort of hovering around us and really get towards collective action. Because what they're trying to do is overwhelm and exhaust us immediately. And it's up to organizers and activists to be the energy for everybody else and try to turn the page on where we're going at the moment.
Thank you, Jason. Maritza, what are your thoughts on this, please?
Yeah, so unfortunately, out of that long list that you named, there were other things that were still missing. There was so much that happened, and I don't even think it's been a week. Like it'll be a week tomorrow. Like so much, right? But there were two things that the Drug Policy Alliance is really keeping our eyes on. One was how they're using the overdose crisis as an excuse to militarize the border, yes, but my concern has been that they've been building legal pathways and a political opportunity to invade Mexico. I'm really, really concerned about this. And we saw this with one of the initial executive orders to come from the Trump administration that designates certain cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. This could have really awful implications generally for people in the US who are even associated with drug activity, including end drug users, which is a huge concern. But I really think it's another reason, as Jason said, to actually attack our civil liberties. But also, like I said, we saw last Congress, they were already introducing bills aimed at targeting Mexico, things like, starting to ask agencies to identify opportunities to go into Mexico, to identify what the cartels were doing, and even bills to designate fentanyl as, a chemical of mass destruction. So, this has been brewing for some time, so that's really concerning. Another thing that we saw was a memo come down from the Department of Justice. It wasn't atypical in the sense that whenever there's a change of an administration, we always see a DOJ charging memo come down. Typically, what we'll see is Democrats will ask prosecutors from around the country to emphasize certain crimes over crimes that they don't feel are a big priority. Oftentimes, that means that they'll, say that they should prioritize like the big drug trafficking crimes over smaller possession cases, for example. With Republicans, we often see the opposite, but this memo was a little bit different. They immediately named fentanyl and the overdose crisis as a reason for asking prosecutors to charge people to the fullest extent of the law, the most serious offenses they could. Not only that, but they also intertwined immigration in there and, said that, because of the quote unquote invasion and the crime that immigrants are bringing, it's really important that they pursue the most serious offenses. And the offenses that were named in that memo were mandatory minimums. They were the harshest criminal penalties a prosecutor can give someone for under the US sentencing guidelines, but also inclusive of the death penalty, which is really concerning. So just to be clear, the guidance is just that, it's guidance. It's not changing the law, so it can't do anything outside of the law. It's just instructions to prosecutors to, again, pursue the most serious offenses. But the reason that this is concerning is because we saw Trump on the campaign trail talk about bringing the death penalty upon drug traffickers and drug sellers. And that's something that is possible under the law. Whether or not prosecutors will do it is another question because death penalty cases are really resource intensive. And currently under the law, the only way that could happen right now is if a murder happens while there's a drug trafficking instance happening, or if somebody's the head of a criminal enterprise where there's large amounts of both drugs and money involved. But, I think it's a slippery slope to get us to a place where, again, we're hitting people, the most vulnerable people, including people who use drugs, people at the lowest ends of the drug distribution chain. So those were two things that were really concerning. As far as his appointments, the person that he originally named as the DEA administrator dropped out. So right now there's an acting DEA administrator who is a big drug war hawk. He's somebody who has worked in the DEA for a really long time, for decades. Um, but with all of his appointments, including his DOJ appointment, Pam Bondi, their past records, yeah, sure, we can look at that. But at the end of the day, he wants loyalty from all of his appointments. It's all about political loyalty. It's not so much the person's background and experience. Yes, that can inform whether or not we oppose or support or how we engage with that appointment. But this is new in the sense that he's not looking for experts. He's looking for people who will pursue his political agenda. And that's what's really frightening. So yes, we have definitely concerns around the DOJ, the DEA, HHS. I know we will probably end up talking about RFK, but his nomination is also a concern. I've also heard that ONDCP is at risk, and I would believe it. Last time Trump was in office, ONDCP was an afterthought. It wasn't run effectively or professionally. And for people that need more information, ONDCP is the Office of National Drug Control. So it's an office that's part of the executive branch that is really crucial in ensuring that the federal government follows an active drug policy and gets money where it needs to be, including money for harm reduction and health services. Something else that's really concerning that Trump did within his first days was he asked health agencies to stop sending out public information. So this is somebody who doesn't value health, somebody who's, never appreciated ONDCP, somebody who thinks very poorly of people who use drugs. So this is really a recipe for disaster.
Thank you, Maritza, for that summary. That's very helpful. Izzy, your thoughts?
I'll just share. I think I've got like 3 or 4 points. I feel like Jason and Maritza did a really good job of covering just some of the first, like you said, like 6 days, 6 days of action, and want to really emphasize one of the points that you were just making, Maritza, where like the act of changing the law in a formal sense takes longer than like a day and a letter. So that doesn't mean that these executive orders and other moves are not concerning, but just want to frame that. And I think Annie, in your intro, you were talking about how one like the move to declare XYZ constitutional or non-constitutional. Thankfully, although it can be a headache sometimes, the fact that there is internal procedure means that the president can't just say that something that is in the Constitution is not anymore. So that again doesn't mean that we shouldn't fight, doesn't mean that there isn't a big fight ahead, but just want to like create a little bit of that distance between like the media cycle, what's coming out in that context, and what's really going on. Although the signaling is as concerning as it sounds, like that's all very, very real. So maybe a couple quick points. First, as we were talking, I was just reflecting on the last very visible head of state who declared not just a war on drug dealers, but an openness to just like straight up, execution and extrajudicial killings. Duterte currently facing some serious consequences with the International Criminal Court. Now, the United States, and certainly not Trump, or I should say the Trump and even, less of the United States, like have that much like of an opinion about or care very much about these kind of like international criminal bodies or international bodies. The US is notoriously kind of on its own in that way. But I'm just like putting aside that lens for a second, like on the global scheme of things, most of the world recognizes that this type of policy is nonsensical and actually might be a crime against humanity. So I just want to remind myself also that putting this in context is a little bit helpful because so much of the world, the American, the AMA, much less WHO, much less all these UN bodies, have gone leagues and leagues ahead and have already figured out that more sane, compassionate drug policy involves certain qualities that that the U.S. is deviating from. So on one hand, we have a little bit of that reference point, at least to start, and to remind us that it's not just the U.S. kind of leading the way, but that the rest of the world is actually like, okay, unified in some ways, or at least moving toward the outcome that I think we want to more collectively see. So 2 more quick points. One, I think I said this in the last small gathering we had before, right after the election, but it's just with respect to appointments. I know we'll talk about HHS and so on in a bit, but love reminding people that Matt Gaetz for 2 whole days, for like one whole media cycle, was going to be the Attorney General. And that just really quickly kind of fell apart. I'm not going to speculate on why, but there's a lot of reasons, if you do a quick Google. So I just say that to say that like I am still, I know this is probably a not super satisfying answer, but somewhat in a wait and see mode about the appointments, because I think that there's a lot of assumption about who's going to get confirmed and not, whether it's RFK or others. And I do think that there are a number of interests that are at play that might kind of, do some king making, you could say, over the course of the next couple weeks. Which brings me to, I guess, sort of my last point, which is what's, I think, some of the things that Jason and Maritza brought up, and I'm sure people are seeing in the cycle. I'm noticing this tension emerge within the Republican Party, which has been on display, I think, for a while, but is so much more visible in this administration than ever before, which is this increasing tension between what I somewhat pithily call the techno-feudalist class and then the old school prohibitionists of the GOP. And the reality is the kind of like more libertarian leaning, tech oriented wealth that has historically been like sort of progressive in some way, or at least associated with progressivism because it was in California and the Bay Area, has, to Jason's point, kind of flipped. And whether it's for political expediency or cynicism or, power dynamic, whatever the reasoning is, have aligned themselves with the current GOP. Now, the hard thing about that is that that new class of wealthy people who are, trying to push for a lot of influence in this new administration tend to love drugs. And the reality is that a lot of Republicans do too. So the fact that the anti-drug kind of prohibitionist criminalization approach has been kind of internally contradictory or hypocritical isn't really news. I think that's been true for a long time, but it's just more on display right now than ever before. So I'm really curious about who wins. And there's a lot of pessimistic or concerning predictions that I think have been very well put by Jason and Maritza, and I have a few myself. But one of my more optimistic ones is that because of this internal tension, the like actual like war on drug prohibitionist ideology is actually on the chopping block, and it may be Republicans that snuff it out of themselves. Like I could see a version of reality where like that shifts. Now, to Maritza's point, it's very politically advantageous to use it, even if they don't believe it. So they might still use it to militarize the border, to go to war with whoever, to attempt to end birth rights. They might do all these things using that language. But I'm curious about when the balance of political expediency and some sort of internal cohesion actually like clash and have to transition. So more to say about that, but I think that along with the lack of reporting information like that to me is one of the most concerning things, because everything else is detailed, but if that public information isn't out there, then I think that we're actually like you have kind of an enforced post-truth era, and that's a freaky situation. So I'll leave it at that for now because I know we have a bunch more questions, but yeah.
Thank you, Izzy. Ooh, techno-feudalists. What a phrase.
It's not my term. It's, I think, Venice. I'll see if I can remember his name. He's a Greek economist who has spoken a lot on this kind of new frame, but yeah.
Well, let's talk about some of these potential techno-feudalists. Let's start with RFK Jr. Again, speculative right now, but could potentially play an interesting and impactful role going forward. I know a number of people who attended his inaugural ball in DC. So, Jason, let's start with you. What do you think of RFK Jr.'s potential impact?
Oh man. So first, I'm not sure I would qualify RFK as a techno-feudalist. It's definitely like the Elon and Jeff Bezos that like actually own these entire, digital worlds. But RFK used to be a Democrat and then ran as an independent when that was politically expedient, and then signed up with Trump when that was politically expedient. And so all of these folks, it is, as was mentioned earlier, hard to look at their history as being indicative of where they're going to go moving forward, because they're willing to kind of shift with whatever makes the most sense under a new administration. And so that being said, he has been very public about his stances on both cannabis and psychedelics, and that did not stop him from being the appointee. And it doesn't seem to be actually the biggest thing, his biggest hurdle when it comes to actually getting, affirmed some of his stances on food and junk food and different things around the agricultural space, and corn and things like that are probably going to be a bigger problem for him in the political sense. But I think for us, of the administration, he's the person that has been as vocally supportive of our efforts as any of them are. And HHS, like Health and Human Services, is a ginormous entity for somebody who has never run a government office in his life to be able to manage. So yes, it does oversee the FDA. And so that's a huge part of any kind of drug policy or actual regulated access system, right? For any, whether cannabis or psychedelics, if there are regulated access opportunities, it's going to have to go through the FDA. But it also oversees things like Medicaid and Medicare, and whether or not those insurance networks will cover certain types of drugs or different types of therapies. And so I am very concerned that the scale of the entity that he is about to oversee is just so big that whatever his personal political leanings are, he's going to be very limited in being able to implement that in an effective way, right? So I have, of the administration, I'll say I am most hopeful that an RFK administration over HHS will do things like meet with our communities and actually hear us out and be able to engage in real dialogue where they are trying to come to the right answer. That being said, it is going to be about a broader international drug policy and whether or not legalization moving forward fits into that framing of how they want to shape the world. And I am very concerned, as Maritza said earlier, about how they're going to handle drug dealers, right? And that's going to include folks that grow their own mushrooms at home, right? Like you can be classified as a dealer, right, if you're growing your own drugs at home. And that is going to be something that, they could move forward on. I'm very nervous about their ability to differentiate between drugs, right? And that the fentanyl crisis or the fentanyl, I'm going to say the fentanyl scare that they're manifesting, right, in this particular situation could leak out into everything else, right? Where they just stop really differentiating, scoop everybody up, and then like let the courts figure it out later. That's very possible, right? And I think earlier we mentioned that they control both the legislative and executive branches, and Maritza can talk this more forcefully, the judicial branch is not exactly hopeful either when we're looking at that as being a check on what things can happen. So to bring it back to RFK, it is hopeful him as a person has been very vocal about this. He's been very clear that he's probably the person we should go to the most to try to at least get into the administration. That being said, the shifts I've seen in every other facet of drug policy lead me to believe that he will be limited in his ability to actually do anything progressive.
Thank you, Jason. And we will dive deeper into the pure techno-feudalists, Musk, Bezos, and I would include Zuckerberg in that as well. But first, let's stay on the RFK Jr. discussion. Maritza, your thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, no, I think he obviously has more progressive views on some types of drugs, and I agree with Jason. Maybe there's a potential there, but I still have that concern that at the end of the day, they're going to be like tied to whatever President Trump wants to do. They're political loyalists, no matter their beliefs coming into the job. So there's that concern. And my overarching concern is the fact that this man does not believe in science or evidence-based anything. I mean, I'm not even talking about his vaccine stances, which are very concerning. I'm talking about even his stances on treatment for people who use drugs. He's been talking about some type of farm therapy that's, again, not based on evidence that he believes work for him. It's an abstinence-based only type of treatment that we know actually could really harm people. We know that people could actually experience overdose after leaving abstinence-based treatment. So it could actually be deadly. It's not based in evidence. There's a lot of treatment that can work, but he hasn't been an advocate for those forms of treatment. So that's really concerning. We need somebody who's helming HHS, who understands science, who follows the evidence, and he just hasn't shown that he can do that. And plus his views on remaining abstinence and the way that he even talks about himself as a former drug user are just concerning. So yeah, I don't have a lot of hope. We'll see if he's actually confirmed. I think he has a harder path than some of the other nominees.
Thank you. Izzy,
I'll just say just quickly that his hearing is on Tuesday. So folks can hear like what he actually says. And between now and then, send your representatives questions to propose to RFK. So folks can definitely contact Congress people to try to get a good question asked.
Yeah. please.
Yeah, thanks for flagging the timing and appreciate both of your thoughts, y'all. I think that just reemphasizing Maritza, the point that you've made twice now, which is the loyalty versus policy positions thing. Because like if we're engaging on the level of the policy positions we believe people have based on what they've said on Twitter or what they've said over a campaign or what they said 14 years ago or whatever, we might be missing the point. And I'm not saying that that's true here. I do think that I like to believe even through my deep fog of cynicism that there is some room for something that's not just absolute kind of unwavering loyalty to some imagined framework. But I do think that I'll respond on the level of the policy, and that's the conversation we're sort of having. But I think that there's a level outside of that that's kind of like where the issues themselves, ironically and tragically, are kind of distractions from like this kind of core thread of what's trying to get pushed through. So that's a key point. Just with respect to RFK specifically in the position, I mean, I like actually what Michael Pollan said about it in Politico a couple of months ago, which was basically differentiating kind of food policy and positions from the kind of scientific ones. There's things that I've heard that RFK has shared about the food system, about like not the farming recovery piece, but the actual like access to nutrients, access to food in schools, taking pharmaceutical advertising off of TV. There's a bunch of ideas in there that are really good and that I think I'm glad are being raised and have been getting raised in the public conversation. Part of the distinction, though, is that what's good policy from a food justice perspective, you could say, there's a reason it's not there's a having healthy food for kids is a like obvious thing that I don't think anyone would disagree with. The reason we don't is because of a very, very massive, well-funded lobby that has been working for a very long time to create the system that we have. And my question is the current kind of like semi-anti-authoritarian, get back to the roots sort of energy of this libertarian side, sort of represented by RFK, although it's more than just libertarian kind of mix, strong enough to overcome the existing like glacier of real industry influence that's been in that realm in general. So that's within the food stuff, and I'll put that aside for now. And then with respect to the drug policy and the science, I mean, with respect to the point you were making, Ritza, about RFK's position on recovery, for example, I think that this is going to sound controversial, but I think that there's something that we could all learn from each other here. One of the big critiques I've had of the psychedelic field and movement, and it's not a critique so much of the field, but like how we are orienting toward it in our developmental phase as a society, is that people have a tendency to over-index on their own experiences, to think the experience that I had is representative enough that I can then draw conclusions about how other people should live their lives based on my experience. It's very common. It's because, especially the psychedelic experience is so high stakes, it's so personal that we're like, wow, this universal truth must be anyone's universal truth. And there's a lot of shadow to that we can go into. But I think that's what RFK is doing with recovery. Like there's lots of evidence that there are a lot of different ways to create access to recovery for substance use disorder. There's lots of evidence to your point that straight up abstinence-based methods don't work. I think that there are probably a lot of people for whom going and working on a farm would be a great way to reset and balance their lives. So I'm not saying that that won't work, but the fixation on that as like a primary method and like a kind of loose statement to like put all the funding or resources toward that, as if we don't have like an existing recovery industry that people are constantly falling through the cracks of, partially because it's so abstinence-based and doesn't necessarily have this larger harm reduction lens, to me is that classic thing where it's like, oh, I'm glad that this thing worked for this person and for these people. And also expecting that that would work for everyone, I think is a recipe for disaster. And again, this is talking about like the policy position side. Like there's been lots of conversation on advancement and how to talk about and think about recovery. And it's another thing. Like we want to collectively find a solution to it. It's going to be a social, it's going to be interpersonal, it's going to be all these other pieces. So the kind of reductionism that like we can just send people to these kind of frameworks because it worked for me, I think either has to get challenged or will prove to fail. And then so finally, I think just making a distinction between like what is science and evidence-based and what is not. And my last very controversial point is that I think that there is this very interesting thing happening to science and a recognition of science as this like modality that uses a particular evidence base with a particular way to define evidence to figure out what the truth is. And when you're looking at it from like an indigenous or earth-based framework, science is in fact a very limited colonial narrow epistemology. So there are a lot of limitations that science doesn't get to. Now, the problem is that when you have someone exploiting that, not to say, so we should think about these more like esoteric or earth-based or framework, ecologically aware frameworks, you've got, so that means nothing is real, so you should buy the snake oil. That's the problem. So I want to say methods that we use to understand reality, which is sort of like underlying what's happening here. And then, but it just, people are so desperate, it's very easy for them to then slip into, oh, so try this fantastical solution that looks more like, yeah, looks more like a distraction than something that can actually help. So there's a lot to tease apart here.
Yeah, there is. Thank you, Izzy. I just want to say that we have less than 5 minutes remaining for this portion of the discussion, and so many more things that we could talk about. So, with the time we have remaining, here are some of those things. Musk, Bezos, Zuckerberg, the impact of DEI and mass deportations on people of color and targeted racist drug war actions, expanded role for the VA potentially in drug research and policy, and support for veterans, which is one of the few bipartisan efforts in DC that we have seen, and how this might be expanded. Plus, what would you say to LGBT people and people of color who are finding themselves fearful in this new administration? So those are some topics, and we have a few more minutes to explore that, and then we'll go to direct questions from our participants. Who would like to take on any of that to go forward with a few minutes we have remaining? Jason.
Sure. So a lot to unpack there. I definitely encourage folks to look up the techno-feudalist side of things because I do think that's the world we're living in. I've been a big fan of that work as well. And so one of the things with having these folks like Elon Musk in the Doge department, right, is definitely the first time I ever had to look up what was the drug policy of Nazi Germany. So that's, an interesting experience I had to have because of this. And it is not great, right? Like these folks are not actually people that have run government agencies. And so when they come in, they're just going to say, we're going to wave a magic wand and solve all these problems and just start cutting left and right. And so in a positive sense, there's no sacred cows anymore, right? Like there's nothing in government that's like too loved that we can't get rid of it, including things like the DEA, right? Like, but just eliminating the DEA would be chaos. And so it definitely would need to figure out exactly what that looks like. And so anything is possible is definitely the positive situation here, but anything negative is also very possible. And it's not like we're going to do this through a competent lens, like, or a slow methodical lens. Things could change very quickly and change back in different ways. And so I think as organizers, we have to be ready for just about anything happening. When it comes to the DEI stuff, so as someone that worked on the cannabis equity policies quite a bit, that is going to create all kinds of ripple effects throughout the government. Veterans will be negatively impacted by that, but a lot of our programs that are specifically meant to help undo the damage done by the war on drugs, a lot of the funding that went to various, community organizations and community groups through cannabis equity funds are up on the chopping block, right? Like there will be local politicians that seek to curry favor with the federal administration and go at those programs in a local sense. And so I do think that everyone, wherever state you're in, whether it's progressive or conservative, there's going to be a lot of defense that we're going to have to play to protect the programs that we spent the last 20 years building. And so I do think that DEI effort, right, is going to be hugely impactful when it comes to racial justice, specifically all the equity programs we've built in drug policy and the economics around it, right? And there are lots of people that are in incredible positions that help oversee different entities that are protective of people of color, ombudsman's positions, they're all gonna come under fire. So like locally, finding out which programs you actually do think are worthy of protection and reaching out to those people and saying, how can I help you? Like what is going on? I think is definitely folks should start exploring immediately.
Okay, thank you, Jason. So let's go directly to some of the questions. And here's a question that really builds on what you just said from CAPS. And the question is really, how can the everyday person help to make a difference in drug policy in the atmosphere that we find ourselves in? And Maritza or Izzy, do you have thoughts on that also, since you didn't get an opportunity in the last final minutes? It's an interesting question.
Yeah,
Yes.
sure. So people should follow the Drug Policy Alliance. We are always shooting our followers information about stuff that's happening at the state level, local level, and from my perspective, things that are going down at the federal level. For example, right now there's a really bad fentanyl bill that's moving through Congress that's basically like the crack cocaine sentencing disparity all over again. It lowers the prosecutorial threshold to go after fentanyl cases and actually makes it so that fentanyl analog cases are punished more harshly than fentanyl itself. So it's really, really concerning. But if you all follow the Drug Policy Alliance, we can link you up with your members of Congress and you can easily contact them about how they should vote on this bill and other bills. So follow the Drug Policy Alliance, you'll get fast information, and we're able to connect you also with your lawmakers.
Thank you. Izzy, your thoughts?
Yeah. I'll also connect this to the other question, which is how to not succumb to the doom and gloom, which is kind of a similar point to, I think, some of the core pieces we're talking about. So I'll just rapidly comment on a couple of things. I First off, I think follow our organizations, follow DPA, follow LPP, follow MAPS, come out to our conference this summer in June. Psychedelic Science will be a good time, and I've been calling it's like the good, the bad, and the ugly. There's a little bit of a lot of different things there, and I think we'll really see some of these on full display. And just speaking to the relationship between the larger drug policy conversation and psychedelics in particular, it's always been an interesting, complex conversation in the last few years, primarily because there are things that are coming up in the psychedelic policy conversation around like sales and personal cultivation and so on that may be kind of downstream from where we landed with cannabis, and signals of where we might go with other substances in the future. And I think that there's this theme in multiple questions and multiple of the things that you said, speaking myself as a gender relaxed, gender fluid person who has multiple ancestries, including Colombian, who Trump actually went after Colombians today. You thought the list was long enough, and Colombia is one of our biggest allies, but I think because of Petro, and that's again a rabbit hole I won't go down right now, but I'm just like seeing this situation as clearly as I personally can, not just from MAPS as an organization, but from me personally. And I just want to go back to Jason, what you were saying at the very beginning, which is that like there is an intentional strategy to like overwhelm, to like, short circuit the system. And that is an intentional tactic. And that's not to say that things are not concerning, but I think we reduce our capacity for response if we're not able to kind of sort through what's really going on and what's being prioritized or so on, because there's so many things happening at the same time. It's very easy to like let things slip. And then even if one of those terrible policies gets through, we're in a situation that we have to undo so much down the line. So we can't do everything. We shouldn't. It's too much, and it would burn everyone out to try. But I do think that like this is going to sound so corny, but just like taking a breath and taking a second to like build that kind of media literacy, build that kind of literacy of the civic government system to know how things should work. And then I think just finally, with respect to some of the larger kind of themes that you were bringing in, Annie, I'm not going to comment on personal use or like the actual like positionality of some of the supporters at this time. I do think it's very interesting that while my personal line and MAPS's line and a lot of what we've been pushing in the last year and going forward is expanding pilot programs and some of this interest in psychedelic policy beyond veterans to first responders, including and especially frontline healthcare workers, and I would say healthcare providers in general as like one next step. You've also got victims of crime, people who've been impacted by the war on drugs, kind of what you were saying, Jason, around like who does DEI really cover? There's so many DEI programs that were about putting veterans into work over the last few years, not to mention so many other groups. So I think that once some of the secondary impacts of some of these like broad kind of sweeping points starts to show, we might see a world where either some of it gets pulled back or like just renamed or reframed. I thought it was really funny that it's like dark humor, forgive me, but it's one of those things where it's like if people are there was in one of the orders like if anyone's trying to rename DEI to say something else and you know that that's what it is, then make sure you say it. And I'm like, I think it's there's this like dark irony in the GOP saying that, which is like an absolute master. That is one of the things that the GOP has done really well in just like renaming things to imply that they mean something else and they're just doing the thing they want to do anyway. So I just think that we're in this sort of like very meta world where if you don't see that it's happening, then it can feel like, oh my God, we're all getting screwed in this and that way. But what's happening actually, I think, is like a reinforcing of this system that's already been there and that is now just more on display than ever. And in some ways, I think that that could make it easier to challenge or more possible to like talk about, not just to challenge politically. And this goes to like what you can do. The post-truth era has to have some sort of breakthrough with how we relate to each other. And I don't think that we should tolerate the like hand waving, well, like this is a thing that I support, so and I'll just let this other thing go. Activists in particular have to really sit with. Because like what we get at what cost is a question that we should really be asking. And I guess this sort of brings us to like, what is the point of what we're trying to do? If you're just trying to get more psychedelics to people, then like go be a drug dealer and good luck. Like, but if the point is something that where psychedelics maybe are a tool to some sort of more compassionate, more just paradigm, then like we can't just be horse trading at that level of the policy, but also need to look at these bigger things. And yeah, I can say more, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Izzy. Let's go to some specific questions here again. Gina has a question about the techno-feudalists. What are your thoughts about the potential impact of these groups monetizing and capitalizing on drugs and psychedelics? Maritza, do you have thoughts on this? You're shaking your head in a thoughtful way.
I mean, that's always been a huge concern. That's been a huge concern around marijuana for the longest time, which is why we are not thrilled about big cannabis, big tobacco, big alcohol wanting to get in there, which is why we couldn't support rescheduling either. We need to actually deschedule, and we need to do that through a legislative framework that makes sure that there isn't corporate capture. But Izzy, I'll kick it back to you because I saw you came off mute for this, and I feel like you're the one who brought this term to us. I hadn't even heard of this until you said that. So
I hope I don't regret that. I will say that good luck. I think that I've come kind of full circle with this thing. And has the attempt to fully corporatize the cannabis industry stop the flow of cannabis through everything but legal regulated access? Hell no. Anyone that knows anything about psychedelics knows that they're going to happen and move regardless. And if you know a little bit about the history, even of the psychedelic underground, you'll know that a lot of groups have tried to be the ones who run the thing for a long time. And to be fair, they didn't have like, the benefit of these massive government systems, except for the CIA sometimes. But like, I think that I do have this, I don't know, maybe this is me being delirious and hysterical, but I do feel like there's a certain level where the attempt to, the story that psychedelics can be totally fit within a corporate, totally money-making structure, I think is a bit of a delusion. And while I do think that there could be a medical system that is part of that larger thing with the coverage and the things where people will make money and there may be large valuations and so on, the idea of that you can stop the flow. This is true of other drugs too. So this is why we say like the route to respond is not just trying to plug the hole of, let's say, fentanyl coming into the country, because like that's not going to work. It hasn't yet. It won't now. It's the same with these. So I'm not saying that I'm not concerned about like the move toward that, because let's say we get like, yeah, we're super cool with psychedelics. We hate fentanyl. We're going to criminalize all that. We love psychedelics. We're going to put it into this channel. And now our big business friends are going to be the ones that run it and make all the money off of it. That would be a very suboptimal outcome for a lot of reasons. And it's not that I'm not worried about it. It's just that I trust the underground to adapt as it always has and always will. Yeah.
Indeed. Thank you. Trust the underground to adapt as it always has and always will. Interesting comment. Jason, please, you had some follow-on comment on this.
Yeah, and so I think the goal, or at least what my strategy is going to be moving forward, is actually to try to pit the techno-feudalists against the old school conservatives to crack their understanding about progress, right? And what progress means, because the techno-feudalists do believe like they are God kings that have no reason to be stopped by the government, where the conservatives feel like, no, we should stop progress constantly, right? And so I actually think there is some tension there that we can use that will push drug policy forward, because at the end of the day, I think the techno-feudalists are going to win that battle. Their financing is so dramatically ginormous that I think they'll outlast the other folks. And I will remind folks that things like the Farm Bill and the legalization of hemp, although it was very problematic, did happen under Trump's last term. And so there are ways that we can have these folks debates within even their own framings, how different types of drugs could be pushed in society that does end up becoming progress for us, that does limit the amount of folks that are incarcerated. We are seeing now cannabis is sold in stores throughout the South. And so this entire idea of whether cannabis is legal or not is getting very murky, where you can sell hemp-derived, hemp-derived cannabinoids, but also just straight up hemp flower in a place like South Carolina or Texas. And so these folks are going to have to address that tension while somehow remaining within their framing of the world. And I don't see that being able to hold over the next 4 years. And so if we're able to pit those two viewpoints against each other, right, and then use that momentum to find where there is some, the corporatization of it all has been a part of everything we've been dealing with so far. We live in the United States. And so I think a lot of us are ready to have those conversations about how to protect from corporate power. So at least in that aspect, we do have some intellectuals and folks that know how to fight that fight that can help us regardless of the substance or the situation that we find ourselves in.
Thank you, Jason. We've got a big question here from Neil that I'd like to run past you all. How do you compare and contrast the potential appointees of HHS, DEA, DHS, FDA, et cetera, from this administration versus the last administration in terms of moving the policy of making psychedelics more accessible, not necessarily commercial selling? Izzy.
I can start. I don't have like a person by person analysis. That would be a good thing to figure out once the like actual confirmations are done. Like I said, I think that it would be a little bit premature to do a one-to-one comparison at this time. But and this is one of those classic dilemmas that I think a lot of people in the, especially the U.S. political sphere, have to deal with, which is people hear a critique of the Republicans and think that they're a Democrat or vice versa. And I don't want to speak for my co-panelists here, but I haven't felt represented by a U.S. political party since as long as I can remember. So just want to clarify that, like, we're not saying like we're worried about these guys that are coming in because we really love the last batch. Like that is extremely not what's happening. And I guess what I would say though is that there is a certain predictability to cynical neoliberalism, which is kind of like the way the US empire has chosen to operate for the last bit of time. And the predictability, I guess, is an advantage tactically in the sense that you can kind of guess what the corporate political class will do because it's in their interest. And you see this with like, I don't know, like internet freedom or deregulation of different industries. There's some not super great, but at least like general direction. The thing that I think makes this new round so interesting, and also the tensions that we've been naming, making it harder to predict, or will make it harder to predict what's going to happen because it's not quite that the GOP has a clear unified strategy besides like locking down opposition and controlling stuff. But the thing about wanting to be like the king of the castle is that there's only one of them, and everyone wants to be that. So I think that that's like those kind of internal contradictions like will have to navigate, and maybe they'll all like would do whatever Republican version of Kumbaya is and be like, we're aligned in the interest of this particular thing, like, nationalism and money and white supremacy and so on. But I just don't feel like those interests are actually so different from the other ruling parties in the United States and ruling kind of states. So there's this thing there. Again, I'm not trying to be too conspiratorial or kind of reductive about it. But I do feel like, I guess the TLDR here is that the internal contradictions that we're kind of naming and the tensions here, I think that maybe this is me being naive now, but I think that they have to play out. Like there has to be some sort of direction because at some point, like the drug loving new funders of the modern GOP will come into contact with the Jeff Sessions types. And like, I'm just imagining the standoff, like, do we love money enough to put our differences of weird moral opinion aside? I don't know. We'll see.
Okay, thank you. We've got some questions piling up here in the Q&A and also the webinar chat. So I'm going to ask panelists to begin to offer succinct answers so that we can get to all of these questions here because there's some good ones. Psychedelic Society of Minnesota asks, can you expand more on crimes against humanity, quote unquote, as it relates to drug enforcement and how that could be implemented under international law?
I can say it in one sentence. There are two major, I mean, there's multiple, but there's two really major areas of international law that are relevant to drug policy. One is international humanitarian law, including like human rights law, protection of rights for humans, and then one is this international drug control scheme. And over the last 10 years, there's been a clear tension where, especially at the international level, it's become clearer and clearer that you cannot both enforce the international treaty obligations related to drug prohibition and also the human rights provisions. They are at odds with each other. So there's two major international systems that are both the law of the world, in that paradigm, and they it's increasingly clear that they contradict. So that's the question is like, is it the humanitarian human rights approach or is it the kind of criminalization prohibition approach? You can guess which one I'm on, but that's the crimes against humanity being like there's no way to enforce drug laws as they currently stand without fundamental human rights. That's the issue. So it's like, yeah, I hope that was clear.
Great, thank you. Another question from the Portland Psychedelic Society. What is your sense of Trump's policy on allowing states to form their own policy around drugs? Who would like to take on this question?
This is my biggest question. I don't know. This is
all right. Okay, Izzy, you're on roll. Go for it.
No, I was just saying that I don't know. This is my biggest actual question that I can see going both ways. I'd love to know Jason or Maritza's thoughts if they have.
Okay,
I mean,
Jason.
I think it's our only path to like real progress in that like they have said that before, right? Trump did actually say that he would vote yes in Florida legalization, specifically said it doesn't make any sense. People are going to jail in Florida if they're in other states and it's legal, right? And so when it comes to that, like convening of the technocrats and the old school GOP, states' rights is the way to do it. Now, of course, like that doesn't necessarily result in positive outcomes, right? Like going back to the states, there was lots of horrendous laws that the states have put forward, Jim Crow, all kinds of things over history. And so we're going to end up again with that approach, which I still, despite all of its flaws, think is probably the most likely outcome to get some elimination of the federal apparatus. We still then have to go back to fight all the same fights in Connecticut and New York and California and all these other places that, while have progressed a little bit on cannabis, have not gotten there yet on psychedelics. And so we're going to get even more of a justice by geography situation, I believe, where you're going to have even more freedoms in the blue states and even more crackdowns at the state level in the red states. And that will be an absolute nightmare where if you're driving down the East Coast, your freedoms are going to change 6 or 7 times between New York and Florida.
Justice by geography. Maritza, do you have additional thoughts on this?
No, nothing additional. I agree with Jason.
Okay, great. Like to go to a question from SP Mexico, noting that what is coming to light in clinical research programs like MindMed, based in the US, developing, phase 3 clinical trials in humans, using molecules like MM120, a chemical derivative from LSD, which doesn't have restrictions, and other challenges like MDMA. Do you think these organizations may reach their key milestones with all this global background? How can we clarify this specifically for psychedelic therapy? Who would like to take this on? Interesting question.
I can try. I was just suggesting. I can try. Because the question is about at its core, among other things, like how this shift in U.S. administration can affect these kind of global questions around drug development and so on. In the U.S., we have analog laws. At the global level, if I'm not mistaken, we don't, and each drug is more or less added independently to the international scheduling systems. So what I understand that to mean, although I haven't looked into this super specifically recently, is that while some of these new formulations or adapted formulations of known drugs, like these LSD analogs and other things, um, may not be affirmatively scheduled by either US or international drug law, analog type laws would cover them. So like I don't really see a version of reality where suddenly like a new market in the underground gets created from a drug that's like a variation that's patented by a company. Like it's not out of the question, but there are lots of drugs, and it feels like it'd be a lot of work for a little benefit. Just knowing what I know about how the kind of especially psychedelic like NPS, novel psychoactive substance drug economy has moved. But I would say the one probably like clearest prediction that I have for this next phase is that big business will be probably just fine. And so anything that gets in the way of these like large biotech and business interests, I just don't really see on the chopping block. And that's coming back full circle, like the RFK stuff, like basically like is the push to deregulate beyond recognition of some of these systems enough in the interest of the corporate class that relies on some of the corporate systems that rely on those regulations, whether they like it or not, is a big question. Like, as I said last time, I think there was a lot of bluster about deregulating the FDA and HHS in the lead up to the 2016 election or 20, yeah, and inauguration and so on. And all of these entities ended up with fairly like run-of-the-mill corporate actors, except for the Department of Education and a few others that were really like pushed toward deregulation. But I just want to say that like it's not, I wouldn't take for granted that the only and primary push is to move in that one direction because I think that there's a lot of unseen corporate interests that are actually would not want that much change to happen. Even if, yeah, I don't know, but that's I don't know if that answers the question, but I think this big business will be the most protected class going forward. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Izzy. We have another question here from Lauren, which is interesting. Can a nonprofit tap into the opioid and tobacco settlements to bring psychedelic treatments to the masses? It's an interesting question. Who would like to take this on?
I'll
Jason?
say that access to the opioid settlement funds is not impossible, although it is very complicated and kind of dependent on states. And so folks have applied to use opioid settlement fundings for psychedelic therapy efforts, but to the masses, I think it's going to be pretty difficult to do that. Although it is a funding source at the local level that I think can get things started, but I don't think that is the most appropriate use of that funding at this point in time, especially seeing how things are going to be moving forward in the fentanyl crisis. And so I would just make sure folks, make sure that if they are asking for that money for that purpose, that the folks that are doing actual direct, opioid overdose prevention work are getting funded first.
Okay. Thank you. That's helpful. Another question from Lauren asking about the benefits and consequences of changing drug policy in Oregon and Portugal. It's an interesting thought. Anybody have thoughts on this? Maritza or Izzy, perhaps?
I mean, I will say like the negative part about it is that it's always hard to be first. And with Oregon in particular, the timing was not ideal. Oregon got hit with the fentanyl wave when Measure 110 was implemented. But even beyond that, like it was set up to fail. There were a lot of corporate interests and law enforcement interests from the very beginning before it even had an opportunity to really thrive, saying that the measure had failed. But it didn't. What it actually did was reinvest dollars into treatment. And we did see that arrests went down, racial disparities in arrests went down. But it's always hard to be first. And it's really important that if you are going to be first, that you really have your ducks in a row, that you have your stuff together, because unfortunately, I think the big takeaway from Oregon is that people think that it failed. That's been the dominant narrative. Um, but yeah, so I think DPA has a really great resource on what happened in Measure 110. I'm going to drop it in the chat if you're interested in learning more. But there was just a lot that, and this is what we see now, right? Like public drug use and drug use generally gets the blame for a lot of other factors, including the high cost of living, including other socioeconomic factors that aren't addressed and that have been truly divested from historically in this country. But also drop some resources in the chat and hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you. We've got a series of interesting questions from the Portland Psychedelic Society, and the first one really focusing on personal wellness and autonomy during this very transitional and unsettled moment. What are your thoughts about a person's inner superpower, the endocannabinoid system and self-care with plant medicines, with nurturing one's nature and returning to wellness? Certainly an important consideration for people taking in this onslaught of news and information. Anybody have any thoughts about that? Izzy?
Yes, this is a perfect example of what I've been talking about, we've been talking about. What someone puts in their body, the category is called sumptuary laws. It's the laws that are related to like what people can put in their own body. I am allowed to buy bleach and drink a capful of it if I want, even though it's like clearly not good for me. And it's a terrible example, but just to like really put a point on it, like I have things in my house that would be very hurtful for me if there were kids around, like that's the thing that we manage that risk in practice and it happens. So it's like this internal contradiction about even drug prohibition has become clearer and clearer as on one hand you've got this like I think very like cynical story on the especially the right, but you see this in libertarian and other places too of like personal autonomy and like liberty. And yet the government is supposed to not just have like a really strong opinion about what you do with your body, but like gets to like have like active gets to make decisions that are about what you put in your body. And I think one of those drugs is like a perfect example of that, where that's like a great example of the contradiction, which is like, okay, what are you about? Like liberty and sovereignty here, or are you trying to control people's bodies? And if so, then like why one or the other? And that brings up, and I think that this is the maybe the next phase that I think that US right and the Republican Party, but also just general more conservative perspectives will have to hold, which is like the same is true about gender. Trans issues are like one of the best examples of personal sovereignty issues. And for some reason, everyone's like all about personal sovereignty until someone else decides to do something with their body, or literally with gender related stuff, like what they're doing in their own mind with themselves. Like it's totally nonsensical to say like people should be free to do this, except for like have a particular thought that makes me uncomfortable. It's just like nonsense. So to me, like these are the kinds of things that are up, like, and with respect to this particular question, like how does it, the person's inner superpower and so on and so on. Like, I think it's interesting that the two biggest camps we're seeing about this conversation within the current political class is one, which is like back to the earth, like nurturing our inner selves, like whole food and medicine, hell yeah. And I like, that's great. We should all be moving in that direction, probably. And then the other side is like drugs are bad, okay? And like there's no version of reality where these drugs are part of your inner wellness. Like it's again nonsense. So like those things have to come into discussion at some point, and I'm not optimistic enough to think that that will necessarily have a political impact because our primary political parties here in the United States can and do operate with major contradictions for decades at a time, and it's just like the reality of the situation sometimes. But I think that like that to me it gives at least some cover among the current political class to push on these issues around like our personal system and so on. Like you hear some of these very, very sophisticated advocates in the veterans world and as well as others, like try telling them you can't grow your own mushrooms. Try being on the right and telling people on your own side that you can't grow your own mushrooms. Like, be serious.
Yeah, good luck with that. Jason, do you have a follow-on
Yeah,
thought?
just quickly, I want to get on a more personal level. We have a lot of fighting ahead of ourselves, and we need folks to be out there being happy warriors. And in the drug policy space, we have the relative benefit of being able to talk to each other of how we handle extreme amounts of trauma, and we have substances that we've used to help us deal with this. We are going to experience a lot of trauma. We're going to be the folks on the front lines pushing against really horrible things, and we'll need spaces to heal so that we can go back out and fight again. So I really think this is the time, like going to the gym right now is an act of justice because we need you to be fit so that you can make it to the end of the march so that we can do the thing, right? And so I do think looking on a more personal level of like making sure we're healthy and we're fit, so we're able to handle what we're about to go into, but not in an afraid way where we retreat and not do it, in that we have the capacity and the tools to be able to fight this fight. And so let's use them. Let's use them affirmatively. Let's show other folks how to be able to organize and heal, but still do very difficult work at the same time. And so I think within this movement, we have so many different types of folks to help us do that. But I don't want wellness to be this, like we retreat from the problems and that's how we get better, right? Like we should be out there fighting the good fight, learning how to rest, and then so we can go back out and fight again.
Thank you. We've got some questions from both the Psychedelic Society of Minnesota and the Portland Psychedelic Society about RIFRA and how this will unfold to support the growing number of psychedelic churches popping up under this new administration. And the Portland Psychedelic Society specifically has a question of how quickly could we seek religious protection to protect indigenous rituals? How would we go about this as quickly and carefully as possible, speaking from indigenous, Latin, native, etc., then also to include others that practice and therefore create, quote, spiritual unquote, religiously recognized protection. This is a big topic, and I think this is important. Who would like to comment on this first? Izzy, please.
It's way too big for the 90 seconds that we have. But what I'll say, this is its own hour and a half of conversation. It's a very complex question and a good one. But the reality is that the current room within religious freedom laws that permit entheogenic churches and spiritual groups to operate, whether explicitly because of court cases or settlements, or implicitly because of the kind of gray area that a lot of churches are in right now, or it is it's wide enough, the aperture is wide enough and big enough that it's hard to predict which direction it'll go. But like that framework right now exists because people don't want to hear this, but because the religious right has um, carved out some of these religious exemptions to generally applicable laws. Now, the right tends to use it for civil rights laws. They want to be exempt from laws that prevent discrimination. Churches want to be exempt from laws that criminalize drug use. So there's this way where the wiggle room both ways. So that is a very interesting. I'm very curious to see how that goes. And ideally, there's another paradigm outside of RIFRA that we can build or work with to create something that's not, that's more of a one way street, you could say. But it's hard to predict now because historically, what happens is that the religious right advances their ability to carve out exemptions to generally applicable, again, mostly civil rights laws. And then the religious groups that work with entheogens can kind of like fill that space and use it for their own rights. The Government Accountability Office released a report a few months ago, basically like calling out DEA for its years and years and years of delay and non-action on the administrative process that allows churches to apply to the DEA. Lawyers are divided about whether or not the DEA even has the administrative authority to do so. I've been on a couple cases related to that, and um, hard to say. But what I can predict cynically is that it's probably going to be more difficult and less protective for indigenous and native groups who probably have like the most like real rooted moral right to the exemptions to these practices here in the land that we call the United States. So it's a bit of a ridiculous and very tragic irony. However, a lot of those protections do exist and have been established for a long time. And most of the people, I'm sorry in advance, but most of the people that are seeking religious freedom and protection right now tend to be people who are pulling from interrupted or lineages that they're taking on and learning, which is very different. And it's fine, and that's a conversation we can have. But that's different, I think, from like registered Native groups or kind of groups that have like an unbroken lineage. It's a very complicated thing about like who gets to decide how legit a religion is. And right now it's a DEA for some freaking reason. So maybe that'll change. But it seems like the DEA does seem to be in everyone's crosshairs, I will say. Like the left, the right, the center, like everyone's like, oh, this is. So I think that that could be one of those like nice side effects where even if we do end up in this like future freaky paradigm that the DEA isn't in it and we have a new, even worse agency. I don't know.
Hard to know. Risa has pointed out that we would like to wrap up this Q&A so that we can have enough time for activations. And I'd just like to thank everybody for a really lively conversation and acknowledge that there were some questions we did not get to, such as RIFRA in terms of the right to try laws and also approaching the social consciousness or unconsciousness behind Trump coming to power and all the politicians and people standing behind him. So those are some additional things, but I'd really like to encourage people to think about those questions as well and hand it back off to Maritza for our activations, please.
Hi, everyone. Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Annie, Jason, Izzy, Maritza, so much for this illuminating and sobering conversation. Lots to think on. We're going on a ride this next 4 years. Yeah. So we're gonna get into the activations, but I want to give a little plug first and just share that we are in the planning stages for our next activation event with Zendo. And it's looking to be early April. And Zendo is coming on board to guide us through a special condensed version of the Zendo SIT program, which is their expert-led training on how to offer psychedelic support and compassionate ethical care for those in non-ordinary states, and actually all states. So it's going to be really exciting. Stay tuned, early April. And just naming that the point of these activations is very much about bringing all of your voices into the room, all of you that are watching this live stream here. So we're gonna do a little experiment, and it might be a little messy, but Jazz is gonna start bringing in the video stream from all of the panelists or from all of the societies into the room. So let us see how that goes. We'd love to just see you, hear you, just give a shout out and let us know what society you are and where you're coming in from. And bear with us as we figure this out.
Cultivate your inner happy warrior while we're waiting. If technofeudalism was the main word of the starting of this talk, I feel like happy warriors is the close. So you can do with that what you will.
Amazing. So those of you, society is ready. I don't know, we can popcorn style this. I can just also name who I see who's ready. And it actually, I feel like it would be really juicy to go with one of our stewards, Mike Margolis, if you guys want to chime in and say hello.
Hello. Thank you all. Thanks. Thanks, Annie, Izzy, Maritza, Jason. That was great. We got a little group here in San Diego. People were actively engaged, laughing at times, or also kind of it was also sobering discussion. But thank you all. It's really good to be here and doing this.
I want to give a little extra love to Mike because he was very much at the helm of this very logistically complicated ship. So thank you, Mike, so much for holding this so powerfully. Yeah, yay.
Right.
Lovely. Yay. All right. Wave your hand if you're ready. We'd love to hear your voice. Say hello.
I can say
Unmute yourself.
Hi there. This is Alyssa from the Psychedelic STL group in Missouri. I got my two co-founders and our small but mighty attendants here. And thank you all so much for hosting this panel. It was great to see you all on this lovely day today.
And the first red state that will pass legislation this year.
Woo!
Ooh, hello, Missouri. Yeah,
that's the
thank
spirit.
you.
That's what I like to hear. Making it happen.
Yeah, right on. Next.
What is that? Baltimore's ready.
You guys are unmuted. Matt, Seth, friends in Oakland.
Yo, Hiker Rising, Oakland in the house.
The Hikerdose family.
Yeah, right on. Oakland represent, California. Casey Hill, you're unmuted. Where are you guys coming from?
We're from Baltimore. So really enjoyed it. We had about 10 people here. You guys did a great job on this. We're looking forward to our own conversation and what's happening here in the state of Maryland and what we can do to promote psychedelics along the way. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Yay, Baltimore. Thank you. Did we just have Gina?
Portland out here. Can you guys hear us?
Yeah, welcome Portland.
All right, we got a small but mighty crew as well. Appreciate you guys entertaining all our questions. Really great job, panel. We're feeling super motivated and stoked to have our conversations here and just so much food for thought. So thank you, Global Psychedelic Society, for organizing. We love you guys.
Yay, Portland. Thank you. Gina, actually, you guys want to put your hands up if you're ready, and then we'll just go in order. It'll make it easy.
I think
Gina, come on in. We'll start with you because you were up earlier.
All right. We're here from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania with the Three Rivers Psychedelic Society. Thank you so much, Global Psychedelic Society, for having us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gina. She was also part of our team, has helped with so much of the activation and brainstorming. Thank you, Gina. So great to have you. Next, Psychedelic Society of Minnesota.
Oh, yeah, I see everybody back there. Hey everyone. Thank you so much for hosting. Yeah, we're getting excited to talk about hopefully getting some legislation introduced here after our year-long task force submitted a really long report to hopefully create a program here. So hopefully we can get some people engaged with their legislators and get some laws passed in Minnesota so we can do psychedelics legally.
Woo.
Thank you for hosting.
Yay, thank you. Neil, Baps.
Yo, we're here, small crew from the Bay Area Asian Psychedelic Society. So we're just, we're all in California. So I'm actively involved here in California on policy issues. So hopefully we'll make something happen in California sometime soon. I don't know when, but we'll see.
I'm looking forward to it. Yay. South Florida.
Thank you, GPS. We've got the South Florida crew here. Got a good turnout, 2 screens broadcasting. Thank you for putting this together. Thank you to the panelists. What amazing discussion. And we look forward to the integration of this conversation.
Thank you, South Florida. Edelic.
So we're here, we're Adelic Center, we're from Eugene, and we got a big 15 people here, and yeah, we're also looking to pass policy reform as a decrim, and so we're excited to be here and hear the progress of everybody else, and yeah, thanks for putting this on. We look forward to the next one in April.
Yeah, Eugene, awesome, thank you. Jacob Tell, District 216.
Can you see it? Can you see the peanut gallery in the back? I don't know. It's kind of hard to see.
Yeah,
They're
we see him out
they're
in
all
the
on the
back.
couch back there. But Santa Barbara, California here. Thanks for having us. It was an amazing panel. We hope to do more, and we're working on a decrim initiative in Santa Barbara as well. So we need to get some West Coast policy change ASAP.
Thank you, Santa Barbara. Awesome. We've got Caps with Kat, one of our GPS members who has also been part of this team. Thank you, Kat, for all the amazing work you've been doing.
Thank you so much to all of the incredible panelists for the very invigorating, thought-provoking conversation. So much to integrate our crew here in Charlotte, North Carolina. And we're really looking forward to our activation event where Gina Theodora in the back right here is going to be leading us with Students for Sensible Drug Policy and the North Carolina Policy Coalition that she founded so that we can start moving the needle in North Carolina for drug policy reform.
Thank you, Kat. Thank you, Charlotte. Madison.
Hello, hello. Thank you so much for this event. Thank you, panelists. Thank you so much, GPS. It's really wonderful to work with you. We have almost all of our organizers here and a brand new member who has come for this for the very first time. So we're really looking forward to working for more. And we've just started getting some really good traction with our own decrim in the city. And we're hoping that this is the year that we can really bring it to City Council. So thank you so much for your support and your community.
Thank you, Madison. Thank you all. Mexico. Yeah, you guys are mute.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for hosting this amazing event. We are very happy here in Mexico. We're receiving all this beautiful community integration. We also have members from the Psychedelic Society from Texas. And also we have visited from Psychedelic Society in LA. So it's amazing. We're connected with you guys. Thank you so much for letting us be here. And thank you so much for everything you're sharing. And also, you're very welcome to Mexico. Please come and visit us.
Yay. Thank you, Mexico. Kansas.
Hey, yeah. My name is Dale, and I'm the president of the Psychedelic Society of Kansas City. Can you hear us? Okay, awesome. Yeah, this is our first ever event. We had over 30 people turn out, so it's been super wonderful and absolutely fantastic to listen to all of you speak and hear these different perspectives on everything, and as well as all the interesting questions.
Yay, thank you. Yeah, welcome. Oh my God, so lovely. First meeting, that's incredible. Wow. You guys, GPS has been working quietly for the last couple of years, and it's not that often that we get to see everybody together. It's such a treat. I see so many smiles right now. It's really incredible to get to do this with everyone. So yeah, so much appreciation. Okay. I just want to give a shout out to Parham, to Jazz, to Vinny. I think I'm like, who else? Is there any other names I'm missing that have been a big core part of this team that have really helped this move this forward? I got everyone right. Okay. So much love has gone into this, so it's very beautiful and heartwarming to see. And and if you might be muted, if you're not muted, please mute yourself. Wait, I'm going to mute you. Okay, there we go. Awesome. All right, so we're going to get into the final portion of our event, which is the activation. I'm so delighted to share it with you. I'll just give a little overview of what's going to happen here. So the idea being that we want to bring everybody's voices into the room. We didn't get enough time to answer all the questions, and so what we're going to do is create an opportunity for you to have these conversations together amongst each other and then give your feedback. There'll be a QR code where you can share what's come up in your group. So we have 3 prompts that our panelists and moderator are going to offer. And you're invited, each society, to break out into groups, self-organize however you want, into conversations, into pairs, whatever feels right. And then either one member of if it's a big discussion, 1 or 2 members fill out the form, or if it's in pairs, fill out the form, whatever feels organic. It's kind of a choose your own adventure process here, but we really want to hear back from you what came up. So all our panelists will get to read your answers, and it can be anonymous, or you can put your name, whatever you want to do with that. Yeah. Okay. So I'm gonna introduce or allow each panelist who has a prompt and moderator to share for 2 minutes. Please don't go over 2 minutes. I will wave my phone wildly to tell you to stop. And then we're gonna kind of close this portion. We'll leave the prompt up for all the societies to break out, and we're gonna leave it up to each society leader to finish off the rest of the event. So it's kind of up to you guys to close. We'll say our goodbye after we've shared the prompts, and then you guys do your own thing. We'll take off the slide in like 30 minutes. But yeah, any questions? Does that all make sense? Yeah. All right, awesome. Okay, so Izzy, would you like to introduce your prompt?
So mine was actually the last one. So number 3. Nice. Thanks, team. So the prompt that I'm suggesting folks get into is about the distinctions between and the trends within you could say like 3 areas, or since someone mentioned the religious stuff, let's say 4 areas of decriminalization, regulation, medicalization, and let's say spiritual use of psychedelics. So I'm suggesting that folks maybe pick one and then figure out which issues are likely to gain attention, require further research or approach resolution. So just as like a simple example, in the cannabis conversation, when the conversation started in the 90s, in the mid 90s to where it ended or where it's continuing, 20, 30 years later, you can kind of see trends of like, oh, this was an issue that people saw as a really big deal, but they don't anymore. So I'm curious, like what people think might be coming up as society becomes more aware of this issue and what are becoming less significant. So just like noting the trends.
Beautiful. Okay. Thank you. All right. Sorry, I went out of order. Like we're gonna go backwards because it's fun to do things different. So next we'll go to Jason, and please share more about prompt number 2.
Sure. And I think we should be ready to go out of order, left, right, up, down. There is no real framing of where things are going to go moving forward. But I do want to draw attention to the fact that there are thousands of folks that are currently incarcerated for cannabis and psychedelic crimes, and that for the most part, these drugs are not fully legal. And so with the Last Prisoner Project, we do a lot of work on policy and advocacy, but we also do actually have direct communication with those who are currently incarcerated. And so I want folks to think about what it would be like if you were in prison for, it could be, producing your own mushrooms at home or cannabis or sharing or promoting, different types of ceremonies that are currently illegal. And if you were incarcerated, what would you like to hear from those who are advocating on the outside to keep your spirits up that we are going to change the laws and eventually get them out, right? And so I think it's important that we remember that there are folks incarcerated that are being persecuted for the same things we're doing now, and just take a minute to not just be able to embody that, but then actually work to connect with those folks and help them come out. And then lastly, while I have the floor quickly, we are doing another mobilization this April, between April 29th and May 1st in Washington, D.C. That will be for the full descheduling of cannabis. I invite everyone to come join us. We are hoping that the psychedelic space will be able to join us more so this year than before. And so definitely, if you're interested in actually lobbying in DC, and we'll have a big protest in front of the White House, that'll be at the end of April. But for now, write a letter to somebody who's currently incarcerated. You can go to lastprisonerproject.org under the Take Action page. There's a beautiful examples there of how you can fill it out. You can go through and see some of the stories and actually decide who you might want to help. I'll point out the person that I tend to talk to the most is Edwin Ruiz, who's somebody that is serving 40 years for a nonviolent cannabis trafficking charge. He actually didn't get caught with anything. Everybody else ratted on him and said he was the mastermind. And he got 40 years in the 90s. He's already spent 26 years in prison already. He has a son that's 27 years old. And so he was in his mom's belly when Edwin was arrested. And so definitely there are folks that could use our help. We could all end up in that position someday. So let's take a minute to really think through what that might be like for us and our families. And specifically, what would you like to hear if you were incarcerated? And then go through and write that letter to help folks out.
Thank you, Jason. Beautiful. All right. And lastly, or firstly, or out of orderly, bringing on Annie from Lucid News. Please share.
I support upending the established order of things. That's why I'm a journalist. Lucid News was founded in 2020. We've been publishing now for 5 years. And we really welcome input from the community. We decided last year to become a nonprofit organization, and we've taken a step back to raise some nonprofit funding to establish and ensure the longevity of our news service, and really ask our community of readers and contributors what they think is missing from public conversations about psychedelics in media, education, and policy. We publish both news articles about psychedelic business, research, policy, culture, and other topics, and we pay the writers for those articles. We also publish opinion pieces. And so if you would like to propose either a news article, especially on something that we're not currently covering or something that you feel we should be, please get in touch with me at ann@lucid.news, ann@lucid.news, or pitch an opinion piece. We don't pay for opinion pieces, but we will work with you to really polish a 2,500 word piece that you would like to share with the world. And we're receiving a lot of interesting pieces like that that we would like to publish coming up. So please be in touch with us, and we look forward to working with you. If there was ever a time in this country where a free and independent press was needed, now is that time. And we're going to continue Lucid in that spirit.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you, everyone. I'm just going to refresh that one thing that came up in the questions is what can we do? What can we do in the current state? And bringing your voices into these conversations, even if you're new to it, even if you're not that familiar, please be brave and put your feet in there into the water and explore a little and get into the conversation, because this is where we start, right? And inviting those of you who have the time in your societies to bring everyone together after these prompts to have a group discussion and just share what came up. So yeah, thanks so much. If for anyone who the link didn't work, it works now. Sorry about that. And that officially closes our portion of the event. Again, we'll leave this slide up for the next 20-30 minutes. And yeah, I'm really excited to hear back from you through that form. And if you want to write us messages, we love getting feedback. So thanks so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Maritza, for having me.
Thank you, Maritza.
Thanks all so much.
Thank
Bless
you.
you all. Have the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Feel free to reach out if you want to strategize. I'm here for you.
Thanks.
Happy Warriors Unite. All right, take care, everybody.
Yes.
Bye.